I'm a graduate student at Columbia, and alongside Mosa Madawi and our team, I helped organize tonight's discussion. For an event titled Columbia and Palestine, I recognize that it may be confusing why we're not speaking on campus behind their gates. This student movement for Palestine began there. After all, in an institution that claimed to be a bastion of free speech and ideological diversity. An institution scaffolded on the legacies of Edward Said and Kimberly Crenshaw. After all, Columbia routinely boasts of its commitments to student activism, from the 1968 takeover of Hamilton Hall to the 1978 protests against Columbia's investment in South African apartheid. During the first semester of 2024, Columbia was the site of the rekindling of the Palestine student movement, inspiring thousands of young people from all different backgrounds and beliefs in our opposition to apartheid and genocide. The students did what our institution had taught us to do, to question the world and lay the groundwork for something better. Columbia responded to peaceful protests with violence and repression, shamelessly laying bare the reality of its intentions for all of us to see. This is the Palestine exception. Professors have lost positions, students have had their identities and addresses plastered on extremist websites. Some amongst ourselves, like Mohsin, have been proffered to federal authorities on baseless charges as our university stands silent. That silence is complicity. Complicity in the deaths of over 75,000 Palestinians, including at least 265 journalists and 5,479 students. What happened at Columbia is emblematic of the erosion of freedoms we have seen on a national level. The nature of the Palestine exception is symptomatic of the latent hypocrisy within our land of contradictions. This country has amassed the largest concentration of wealth, military might, and cultural capital of any society in global history. It is democracy ruled by the people in their name. What we determine our policies to be is a direct reflection of the values we hold most dear. The freedom of speech, of thought, and of debate is most sincerely housed in our universities, upheld by our youth, and guarded by the clarity of their conscience. As our peers mourn the loss of loved ones to American-made bombs, as friends sequester themselves in their homes out of fear of retribution, Columbia, in failing to recognize their humanity, their conscience, has deemed their lives worthless. In their tireless pursuit of endowment donations and their cowardly search for political cover, Columbia has consistently chosen the wrong side of history. This conversation should be at Columbia. We should have the right as students and community members to meet inside the open gates on an open campus. However, Columbia still demands silence from its students, but that silence is complicity. We created this event because we refuse to remain silent in the face of genocide, shrouded in the specter of violence, and idle as our fundamental right to free speech is dismantled. For if we continue to uphold this status quo, what else will a democracy deem unfit for discourse? What other rights, peoples, ideas will we lose to maintain our privileged position in this land of contradictions? In a free and democratic society, there is no greater tool of accountability than to question the rulemakers who act in our name. Those who unleash ICE onto the streets, who detain innocent families, who scrape our online profiles for evidence of dissent. We are not alone in demanding accountability. This same conversation is playing out on campuses, streets, parks, and kitchen tables throughout the country. As the righteous indignation of the students at Columbia continues to ripple across the nation, we turn our attention back to Palestine. I ask all of you to recognize the 75,000 Palestinians, the 34,000 children who have been murdered in our name. We believe that the only answer to this genocide is not further suppression of our outrage, but rather dialogue, honest, open dialogue, relentless in its pursuit of truth and its preservation of our humanity. Dialogue that is anathema to bigotry, Islamophobia, and anti-Semitism. Tonight, you will hear from people who have suffered material consequences from refusing to be silent, who refused to be complicit in violence. They are here to show you that we must keep speaking. To guide us through this night, I am happy to hand the mic to a reporter who famously stood at the Rafah crossing, looked Western media in the eye, and told the truth. Rama Zain.
We can all rest easy. The more important people who are gonna come up are ones who've been organizing, because who here is going crazy as the system tries to normalize burning families alive? Who here is going crazy that it's the students who say, guess what, killing kids is wrong, are the ones that are scrutinized, while the ones who are actually doing the killing are the ones giving speeches at the United Nations, right? So instead of us going crazy, we convene in rooms like this to actually discuss how to put our words into action, where we're not preachers nor teachers, but people who are experiencing trying to be human in an inhumane world. So without further ado, can the panelists come up? In order to help guide us through this experience, we have Mohsen Mehdawi. Rabab Vazuri. And Qayyum Ahmed. And Michael Gallius. Mohsen urged me for this to be an unorthodox setting, and I'm quite unorthodox myself, so it came at a pleasure to kick off the panel with not just how you're feeling, but let's start with the end. What are key messages or key values and learnings that you've had through this experience in this movement? Let's start with you, Mohsen.
Thank you. Can you hear me? No?
Yes, okay. Good evening, everyone. Pleasure to be with you, and thank you also for your courage and for sharing your heart and mind coming here to the stage. First, I would answer, or I would speak to the thing that many of you are wondering, most likely, and the question is, where is Hassan Biker?
Oh, yeah.
Hassan was supposed to be with us tonight, and we had to do a last-minute call because of the level of attacks and targeting that he has been going through from the right and the left, and specifically since last night with the situation in the White House. There are people who are trying to point fingers to Hassan. As we know, this is a whole war on truth. The system is trying to silence us and to censor us from speaking up for Palestine and from sharing our truth, because the truth has its own power. And we had to debate as a team with the People's Forum team as well, whether if we should actually reschedule it or cancel it. And it wasn't as difficult of a decision as one might imagine, because we knew our North Star, and our North Star is to be with you and to empower ourselves and to continue to share our truth. So while we are with you here tonight, Hassan is streaming right now and watching us.
Okay, let's get to the discussion. Without further, it's very interesting. You know, it's sad that in a world where you speak the truth, you get attacked for it, which should be the basic. And they celebrate you once they've discredited you, once they've done with you, when they've imprisoned you. Because we see most people in history who are currently being celebrated, who you are studying in your history books as heroes today, were not considered heroes then. So without further ado, key learnings from your experience organizing, being on the ground.
I would start by my most fundamental and guiding principle that everything I do in my life must be motivated by love, not by fear. When the genocide started, and as painful as the reality that we were watching and seeing, live streamed genocide, I couldn't help but remember the memories and the experience that I had as a child. I was born and raised in a refugee camp in the West Bank. And as a child, I witnessed my best friend getting shot and killed in front of my eyes, Hameda. And then my uncle, who was assassinated on my birthday, I saw him saturated in blood. And I saw many people who have been killed by the Israeli terrorist army. I collected people's body parts with my own hands at the age of 12, peeling their skin off the wall and putting it in plastic bags. And many more stories of horror, and this is not my story alone, this is the story of hundreds of thousands of Palestinian children, and no child should live in such a situation. But one thing I learned early on, that if I allow that pain and that oppression to control me, if I allow that darkness that was imposed on me to bring me into darkness, I would be enslaved for it forever. And the guiding question that I had in my heart, that at every action that I take, with every word that I speak, I must ask myself, does this come from a place of love or a place of fear? And a place of love is a place that I would like to see people living in dignity and equal to each other. A place of love is a place where I would not allow the system to silence me. That when I get detained, I smile to the camera and reassure the people in America, the activists and everybody, that I am not intimidated. When a senator visits me in prison after spending about a week there, I tell him that I'm not worried because I'm fighting for justice and I'm fighting from a place of love, not a place of fear.
You were on the ground with the student workers. What actually works? You know, because sometimes you go to protest and you don't know, am I venting or am I actually creating change? And also, how do you deal with students who maybe see their own professors not standing by their sides when they should? How do you deal with all of this emotion? How do you deal with the organization, and what really works on the ground?
Thank you for that. Yes, so for those of you who don't know, I am the vice president of the Graduate Student Union at Columbia. Of course, like, I am here only sort of speaking from my point of view. I don't speak on behalf of the union or the union's position. But in any case, like, I think, my experience at the encampments, it was, I guess, about 3 years ago. I was a first year at the time, and so I didn't really have that much experience, but I attended almost every protest, and I spent a lot of time at the encampments, and a lot of the students there, it was such a joyous, happy place, as I'm sure many people who were there will tell you. I remember there was singing and dancing. I remember the Jewish students there at the time were holding like a Shabbat. It was really a beautiful experience, and it was sort of interesting to contrast that with there's this sort of duality with Columbia's repression. At the time, I lived in an apartment very close to campus, and so every morning I would hear the sound of helicopters blazing right above my apartment, and the campus essentially became kind of like a surveillance state. I mean, you had to, they were disciplining, suspending, expelling students for speaking out against genocide. And so I think one thing that I've really learned is how deeply intertwined the pro-Palestine movement and the labor movement are on campus. And how deeply this sort of repression of pro-Palestinian activists has affected our labor movement on campus. But I should say that SWC is prepared to fight. We will not back down. We will not be intimidated into silence, and we will win.
You actually grew up in South Africa, and people have been taking South Africa as a success story. And I think who here is hungry for a success, for a win? Yeah. Right? We're hungry for a win, to the extent that when you hear that celebrity you don't even like that much say one good human thing, you're like, that one. How do you find the patience? What can you bring from that lesson of growing up in a place that really needed patience to keep going, that one step at a time?
Well, today actually is April 27th, which is South Africa's Freedom Day.
Get up.
32 years ago to this day, we voted in South Africa for our first democratically elected president, Nelson Mandela. I had just turned 18, in fact, a few months earlier, so I was able to cast my vote for Nelson Mandela, having spent the first 18 years of my life living under a system of apartheid. I should say that while there are often comparisons between South African apartheid and Israeli apartheid, when I traveled to the West Bank during the second Intifada for the first time that I traveled there, clearly it was evident that what Palestinians were experiencing was a form of apartheid, but it was a form of apartheid that I think had metastasized to a point where Israeli apartheid was a fundamentally different iteration of this crime against humanity. And so I draw quite extensively, not only on South African freedom fighters, Steve Biko, for instance, as a symbol of what that potential liberation would look like, but also on Palestinian scholars who have created a vocabulary to describe the conditions under which they are currently living. So genocide and apartheid are certainly terms that have been employed, but Nakba, as a legal framework developed by Palestinian scholars such as Rabia Iqbaria, offer us a vocabulary that really allow us to talk about the Palestinian condition, that recognizes the intersections between Palestine and South Africa, but also acknowledge that Palestine is a particularly a different case in relation to apartheid South Africa. So my hope, effectively, is that one day Palestinians will also be able to celebrate their Freedom Day as we are in South Africa today. And I think the people who have really been leading the struggle for Palestinian liberation here in New York at Columbia University are overwhelmingly women students. These are young women, black, brown, queer women, who have always been at the forefront of the revolution and of the struggle. And these are the young people that I look to today to guide us toward that eventual hope of Palestinian liberation.
But that's interesting. I have a follow-up with that. How do you communicate with people who've never known struggle? How do you get them on board?
What is fascinating, when I'm currently writing a book on the student intifada at Columbia, and I've interviewed just over 50 student activists, including some professors as well. And many of them suggest to me that the reason why they are so caught up in the Palestinian struggle for liberation is because they themselves have experienced some form of oppression. As a woman in a system of patriarchy, dealing with capitalism, as a black person, as a brown person, as a Muslim, as a queer person, I think many of those folks have experienced oppression at some level. And they see the intersection between their struggles and the struggle for Palestinian liberation. So many of them are deeply attracted to Palestinian liberation. Palestine's liberation is in many ways a reflection of their own liberation.
100%. And Micah, this is always the most interesting part. Our professors. We look at our professors, you're teaching me justice, but you're not incorporating it in your life. How have you dealt with faculty? How have you gotten your own message across?
Well, that's an interesting question you ask. And I will say first that I feel a little bit intimidated to be here with all these bright lights shining in my eyes. I have a much larger audience than I have in my graduate course on algebraic geometry. You know, you asked the question, how do you reach somebody who has never had to deal with the struggle? Well, I did not grow up in the Israeli-occupied West Bank. I did not grow up in apartheid South Africa. I grew up on the corner of West 116th Street on Broadway in Manhattan, across the street from the Columbia Gates, and I did not have to struggle with any severe political problems when I was growing up. But I've gradually come to realize that that the struggle that is faced especially by those who are fighting for justice in the Middle East is inextricably connected to what happens in American society in New York, at Columbia, and of course the events of the last 2.5 years really brought that home to us. I also have to say on a personal note that somehow I managed to miss both the student strike of 1968 and the one in 2024. In 1968 I was 1 year old, and my father had a sabbatical leave and took us to the West Coast. Then in 2024, I had a sabbatical leave and I was in Cambridge. And I was very lucky that I missed it, actually, because I'm sure I would have gotten in trouble one way or another. But I watched from afar, and I will say that the actions of the student demonstrators, you might quibble with the relevance of divestment, both in the South African case and in the Israeli case. Whether, suppose that Colombia had announced, okay, we're going to divest, would that have actually changed the situation in Gaza at all? Perhaps not. But for sure, the demonstrators had an uncanny ability to influence public opinion. And I will say, being in Cambridge at that time, within a few weeks of the encampment going up in New York, there was an encampment on King's Parade in Cambridge with tents, and the student demonstrators explicitly said that they were inspired by the demonstrators at Columbia. And all over Europe, public opinion, elite opinion, popular opinion swung very, very dramatically in sympathy with the Palestinian cause. And I think the same thing is true in America. So, Colombia is only a sideshow in this struggle. Colombia is not at the center of what's going on by any means. But we can take a little bit of pride in knowing that the efforts of people like Mohsen, did have a tangible effect.
It was actually interesting. I was in the UCLA encampment, and I remember it was so ridiculous to see media, mainstream media, call these students anything but student, infiltrators, terrorists, anything you can but a student. And they felt alienated, isolated, alone, and they had to strategize by themselves. But one of the core problems that they would sometimes have is how do you bridge that gap between action here in the West and what's actually happening on ground? I remember one student raised her arm and told me, I as a leftist, I told her, rightist, leftist, you're both killing us, babe. So it is a very interesting dynamic. How do you translate what is happening here to the effect that it needs to have on the ground, mainly in the global south?
You're looking at me, so I'm assuming
Yes.
that this is...
I need you to give me all the
Sorry.
answers, Mohsen.
Okay, so maybe we can extend to midnight. I think the biggest effect that we can have is by increasing awareness and consciousness of people all over the world that different forms of injustice are cut from the same fabric, and different forms of injustice are interconnected. And there is something that Martin Luther King has shared. It's a very significant quote, in fact. Injustice anywhere is a threat to justice everywhere. And yes, the pro-Palestine or the Palestine solidarity movement on campuses has created a level of awareness across the world. Something I've been and I was crying for all of my life, and now the veil is down because people see the bare truth for what's happening on the ground, the brutality of the Israeli system and the American system that empowers the Israeli system. But that awareness is not disconnected, in fact, from the injustice that minority groups in this country are facing. Whether if it is African American communities, Native American communities, LGBTQ, women, Hispanic communities, immigrants, all different forms of injustices are interconnected, and the art that an activist or a political thinker must do is how can you connect the dots and help people to see that the struggle for justice for one is a struggle for justice for all. And one more thing about the Palestinian student movement, it also actually has shown it's not only about significant moral stand of divestment, boycott, and sanctions. It's in fact the method and the tactic in which or through which a group can bring a change without the use of violence. Because if you think of oppression, all different forms of oppressions, they are systemized, they are systems, and systems live on money and on manipulation of a truth, like what we saw with the media. And the moment you cut them off from money, not only you create a moral stand, but also you deplete them and you weaken them. And that's what we saw with South Africa when there was an agreement, and actually the World Bank has imposed sanctions, and struggle on the ground and struggle in America and elsewhere has achieved that. So increasing the awareness of the interconnection between different injustices and help people to organize, to unite, and to be able to be clear. One big issue that we faced, in fact, at Columbia, and Columbia is so significant because it's an exemplar. We knew early on when we were building the movement at Columbia that if we succeed at Columbia by achieving our objectives and our goals, which was related to divestment, boycott, and sanctions, almost every other university would follow. We're spearheading the movement. And what we realized early on through that struggle, that the Palestinians, this whole struggle is about Palestine, but one thing was clear and missing, that Palestinian voices were not centered. And if you want actually to advocate for a group of people who are fighting for a struggle, you must center different voices, not to choose and pick as well.
That's interesting. And clap for yourselves as well for showing up honestly. Thank you for being human. I can't believe we need to do this, but we do. Rawab, this is what Mohsen said was very interesting in the sense of what voice you center, who does what, who speaks first, who's the speaker, and sometimes we've noticed ego comes into play when you're organizing. How do you defeat that? And also a second question, when the word divestment would come up, this is when the most suppression of students, because you hit the money. How do you keep going, knowing that once you hit the money, their fangs are going to show?
Absolutely. I mean, I think your question really speaks to, again, how intertwined the pro-Palestine movement on campus and the labor movement on campus really are. I mean, as Mohsen was just saying about how an injustice to one is an injustice to all. I mean, I think what is sort of happening in Palestine actually really affects the sort of material conditions that we are able to win and the protections that we're able to win on campus. So for instance, I mean, our unit represents many students who were disciplined, suspended, expelled for their pro-Palestinian activism. And I mean, for that reason, there's been two main consequences. Firstly, it's made organizing more challenging because it is more difficult to get international students to even sign cards. They're worried about being targeted by ICE, they're worried about being disciplined by the university. And so it's made it more difficult on that front, but also with respect to bargaining. You know, those of you may know that our president minor was expelled for their activism at Hinds Hall, and so the university will not even speak to grants at the table. They can't be seen doing that, and that's actually illegal. It's against the NLRA to not engage in good faith negotiations with the elected president of the union. And so I think that really goes to speak to how, you know, how intertwined and interconnected the pro-Palestine movement is, Columbia's repression, how that's affected our labor union and our organizing efforts. Yeah.
Kayumi, you said something very important, that unity is paramount. I know it sounds like a utopian song, we have to be united. However, it is imperative. I saw Mark Warner at a Sudanese event. He was speaking out for Sudan, and it was like a press release. He'd say one thing about Sudan, for Sudan, and then he'd differentiate it to the Palestinian cause. One thing about Sudan, and then make sure, because they need to nitpick what is according to their agenda. But then how do you unite? How do you unite these struggles? How do you allow a space for these struggles to connect? Where do you find that common ground where people sit in the table and realize that we are all in danger?
I want to quickly respond to two really important things that were mentioned by the previous speakers, and then try and answer this really important question. I think the one thing about the South African struggle which Mohsen picked up on is that not only was there an attempt at boycott, divestment and sanctions, but there was also mass mobilization on the ground. And I do think this is potentially where I respectfully, you know, differ with Mohsen, who is really someone I look up to and admire. But the South African struggle was also a struggle engaged in armed resistance. And I think it's important to recognize that alongside boycott, divestment, and sanctions, alongside mass mobilization, Nelson Mandela, who is often regarded as the grandfather of the peace process, the Nobel Peace Prize winner, is also the person who started the armed resistance struggle through the African National Congress. And this often gets left out of the narrative because we see this, respectable elder figure, but he started Umkhonto we Sizwe, the tip of the spear.
I'm so sorry, because that is very interesting.
Yes.
People will say the word genocide, but will shy away from saying, well, what other options do we have?
Precisely.
Why is it, looked frowned upon, especially in intellectual conversations?
I think the question of armed resistance speaks to how we understand and think about violence. And people often, I think, have a very narrow conception of violence, which is, physical violence. But what armed resistance recognizes that there are multiple types of violence. The violence that we experience every day here as New Yorkers, the inability to pay our rent, the inability to afford health insurance, these are systemic violences of capitalism that are intertwined into the question of armed resistance. So armed resistance, I think, needs to be thought of more holistically. And in some ways, the South African example is one such mechanism that is used in conjunction with diplomacy, with boycott, divestment, and sanctions. I think the second point that I want to touch on was around the question of divestment. One thing I've come to realize about Columbia, it's often referred to as Columbia University. But Columbia is less of a university and more of a corporation. It has, nearly $15 billion endowment. It is the largest private landowner in New York City, which, as we know, New York City is the global capital center of the world. And so Columbia is intertwined with that system of global capitalism. And I think by reframing the conversation away from thinking about how to dismantle this academic institution and thinking about how to take on $1 billion corporation will allow us to develop tactics that are more appropriate to dismantling these institutions that have really been deeply invested in ensuring the continuation of global capital.
Yeah, it was scary. When I was at Capitol Hill, I felt like I was in a company, and there was even the office politics that you have completely detached. Michael, I'm very interested in knowing, I'm not shaming you, as a person who's known no struggle. Knows no
the kind of struggle that these gentlemen have known.
Not shaming you, welcome. But you're more commended because you don't need to take on this space, yet you are. And again, this is a question that I repeated because I'm genuinely interested. How do you then have those conversations with your peers, with your colleagues? Because I'm pretty sure that some of them have not, hopped on the same bandwagon for justice.
No, that's right. I would say that university faculty are individualists by nature, and they're almost allergic to collective action. Even at this moment, when it was clear that the university has been placed in the crosshairs of the federal government, and that the federal government wants to destroy universities and destroy Columbia in particular, it's been a struggle to get our colleagues to mobilize and stand up and work together to try to fight back against that.
Do you have a personal story you could share with us? Someone you don't like, just without naming names.
No, not even without naming names. It's more a question of institutional passivity, and people always. Well, I will tell you this on subway platforms. So often, my colleagues will come up to me, and whether I know who they are or not, and they will say, "Thank you so much for doing what you do." And I say, "Well, if you appreciate what I do, then why don't you join with me? Why don't you stand up and introduce the next motion at the faculty meeting, or write the next article in the Spectator, or whatever it is?" And it's been very difficult. I will say, it's been a struggle to get my colleagues to do that, and there's almost a sense now that since the demonstrations on campus have been suppressed, and since the threat from the federal government seems to have receded slightly, that now the crisis is over and we can get back to doing our work. And I think that's a very short-sighted view. If there are any professors in the audience, I certainly want to warn against that. coming back to what what Kayum and you brought up before about the multiplicity of different crises in the world, I think that's actually something where our critics have a point. The critics are always saying, why don't you talk more about the genocide in Sudan? Why don't you talk more about the genocide in Xinjiang? And they're absolutely right, actually. We should talk more about those things. And you know, there are a lot of crises, there are a lot of boiling pots all around the world that are boiling over. It's also true at the same time that the crisis in Palestine, which the metastasizing crisis, which is now moving to Lebanon and Iran, is one for which the United States bears distinctive responsibility, because we are funding those and participating in those military actions. We are participating in the bombing of Iran ourselves. We are paying for the bombs that fell on Gaza. And in our community, and even in the Colombia community, there are many, many people who are actually very pleased about the military actions that have been undertaken. That's not the case with the genocides in Sudan and Xinjiang. So the situation there is rather different, and the way that we have to handle it is somewhat different. We have to realize that there are those who disagree powerfully with us in our midst.
Yes, well, we're not made of the same cloth, as they say. So, Mohsen, this is an interesting point that you've made about centering Palestinian voices. And here we're talking about uniting struggles. How do you strike that balance? And when people say that Palestine has been the litmus test for humanity and humanity has failed, how do you translate that statement to your own personal struggles and what you've seen, your own personal story?
First of all, I don't think humanity has failed. What failed is the international law that has actually shown its face of the double standard and of the hypocrisy that it holds, that some people can have rights and can be sanctioned, and some nations could be sanctioned and not other nations. And we see this hypocrisy on every level. I mean, what we saw at Colombia, the hypocrisy, the double standard, it's not only the Palestine exception, it is revealing a deeper problem with the system itself, who has rights. To this day, that the Palestinian students, pro-Palestine students, we don't have space on campus. You look at PWG, the Palestine Working Group, suspended, SJP suspended, JVP suspended. And when we apply through other organizations to hold the space and to amplify the Palestinian needs and wants and rights, they create all of the systematic obstacles to prevent it from happening. And this is what failed. What failed is the perception of democratic systems, international law, and it created skepticism in human rights. But humanity has not failed. The Palestine and the pro-Palestine movement, I believe that it is the largest movement in the history of humanity that we've ever seen. Just by the numbers that we've seen all over the world, and by the nature that people were able to see and feel and connect with it, because people are empathetic by their nature. There is no human being with their right mind they can see a father collecting the remaining of their child and putting them in a flower bag in order to bury them, or to see dogs eating humans and can be okay with that. There is no human being who can see a human made, orchestrated, manufactured misery, which the Israelis are creating, where people are dying from, in Gaza, are dying from starved to death, dying from cold, prevented from accessing basic medical care and human need. But humanity has not failed, because we saw the people all across the world marching the streets, pressuring their governments, and speaking up. And to this point, it created a crisis, and it's a rupture in the international system itself. But that does not mean humanity has failed. It means that the hypocrisy has been revealed, and the diagnosis of the issue are in front of us, and where do we move from now is really what matters. On the level of organizing, the biggest issue, I started by saying the biggest thing that I've learned is to act from a place of love. That means I should not be reactive. I should not let the the harm and the pain and the injustice make me bitter because it starts backfiring internally and among groups. And what we saw, the movement has not died, but the movement is fractured. And if we hide this, we are lying to ourselves. The movement has been fractured at Columbia. I visited many other universities. The movement has been fractured there. And big part of it is the trauma of injustice, whether if it's the police that attacked the students or what we have witnessed and saw in Palestine and in Gaza and in the West Bank, apartheid and the genocide. So a basic practice is to be able to regulate the emotions, act from a place and acting with empathy and compassion internally, and keeping in mind that what we need is unity. Because the more we are reacting to each other, the more we are unable to resolve our conflict, we will never be able to actually build enough power to combat giant systems that are fueled by so much money that aims to dominate not only Palestine. We are just the moral compass right now. But if they succeed in, or if Israel get a pass with this, we will see domination worldwide. And I believe that we are able and we will be capable of creating the largest human movement, the largest movement for justice, if people are able to come together and to build together and to envision what we would want to create, which is the system that treats everybody equally, not with double standard where it denies people rights and give other people rights.
I think your perspective is much healthier than mine in the sense that the system has failed humanity. But it is scary because we are part of the system. All of us, whether you like it or not, are part of the system, because if you oppose the system, where do you go? You live in an island. We are all in this big machine. So that's the interesting part there about what do you do? How do you then deal with this system that is designed to oppress you, that is designed to normalize what is very much abnormal? Do you fight it, but then when you break it, what's your alternative? How do you deal with this system that is designed to keep you in check?
Absolutely, I think that's a very important and interesting question. I mean, I think, at least speaking from my own perspective, helping organize SLUC, looking forward, I think it looks like we are trying to win protections for non-citizen student workers, and we are also trying to win academic freedom. And these demands that we are asking of the university are deeply informed by our history doing Palestinian activism on campus. On the point, for instance, about academic freedom, our unit represents many graduate student instructors who were disciplined for speaking out about Palestinian genocide. For instance, I know of one graduate student instructor who was a member of a science department, and it was customary in that class to talk about, how someone from a marginalized background has made achievements in science. And so one week they spoke about Palestine, how Palestinians are making scientific advancements, and how universities are being demolished in Gaza. And as a student in that class reported them, the university immediately issued like a public announcement saying that this instructor was going to get severe repercussions. And that instructor eventually left the university. So even from a self-interested perspective, like Columbia is losing talent in repressing its own students. And so I think that's one very important reason why our union has to advocate for academic freedom. But we're also trying to demand non-citizen student protection. So again, this is informed by our experience doing pro-Palestinian activism. Many international students have been targeted by ICE, by the Trump administration. Many of you know that Ranjani Srinivasan had to leave the United States and could not continue her degree program from abroad. And so in our non-citizen student protections, we're demanding that the university become a sanctuary campus, Basically, that means New York City is a sanctuary city. All of the public universities in New York City are sanctuary campuses. And it means that the university can't just comply with ICE unless they actually have a judicial warrant. And so that's one thing we're asking for, and we're also asking for, international students who are facing visa difficulties. They can't return back to the United States again because perhaps of their pro-Palestinian activism, that they be able to continue their degree program from abroad. So I think our labor union is very excited about these demands. We're ready to fight for them, and I think that is the most effective path looking forward.
Well, good luck. I'm hopeful for. It is interesting what Rawal was saying in the sense of, but what we're hearing is you're so vested in protecting your fellow protester, your fellow student. When are you actually organizing to, as you always speak about, decolonizing these universities? And how do you garner power outside of these universities? Because if you look at Israel, its power is outside. Its power is actually outside with the lobbying, with the programs they do, with the paying influencers, $7,000, which apparently they haven't yet. So how do you get that power even outside of the universities? Because once you're bogged down in the university system, you're just too busy trying to protect one another.
I think that's a very fair point. I think one of the ways in which we get out of the university is through the very much the solidarity that Muhsin was talking about. I recall very distinctly, and I hope I don't embarrass you, Muhsin, by sharing how helpful you were in a situation that I found myself in, which is I got added, together with Muhsin and Mahmoud, there are 6 people on a deportation list. Mahmoud is number 1, Muhsin number 2, I'm 3, and then there are other colleagues, Columbia affiliates who are on this list. And I remember distinctly when Muhsin was released from his incarceration, he was kind enough to take my call and to offer advice and guidance and show solidarity to me, who had to spend 30 days locked in my apartment, which is what the lawyers said was the best place for us to be in order to avoid being arrested by ICE. And I think this kind of solidarity, of sharing of experiences, is something I will always be incredibly thankful and grateful to Muhsin for. And I've seen this kind of solidarity play out across the movement in spaces such as the Gaza Solidarity Encampment, among colleagues, despite the difficult conversations that we have. But I've also seen this level of organizing take place in spaces such as this, such as the People's Forum. So some of our colleagues who can't teach at Columbia because of the adoption of the definition of anti-Semitism have decided to come and teach here. I've just published a book. All of the royalties are going to the People's Forum's political education platform. And I think there are so many ways. The book will probably only sell 5 copies, I don't think. But there are so many ways I think that we can build this kind of solidarity, that we can draw on the lessons that we have learned over the last couple of years and continue to enhance the movement. And I've also very recently been invited into spaces off campus where students are reorganizing. And I think that brings me a huge amount of hope, recognizing once again that these young women, often women, black, brown, queer folks, are leading the next iteration and phase of the student intifada.
Michael, are you on any list?
What kind of list? I was one of the inaugural members of Canary Mission. I'm very proud of that. But
Apparently, when you're on a list, you're doing something good.
yeah, but I just want to say that like you, I remember very clearly the moment when Mohsen was released, and that was about a year ago, and it was a spring-like day, and it was an inspiring occasion. We were at that vigil like the one that we had today outside the front gate of the university. And Mohsen came, and afterwards he said, "Well, would you like to go have lunch at Tartina?" And forgive me for my blasphemy, but it was almost as if you had met Jesus Christ on Easter Sunday. He rose from the dead, and he said, "Well, would you like to go have lunch at Tartina?" That was the sensation that I had. Anyway, you know, I take your point that we need to think about working outside of the university, and I think that those of us who are activists in the university, we need to start speaking directly to the public and directly to the media. We need to learn how to talk to journalists, and that's something I've always encouraged my colleagues to do. Start talking to journalists, and don't be afraid of journalists, and don't be afraid of those who you think might not be on your side. Okay, I wouldn't talk to Fox News, but anyone to the, you know,
They're outside.
yes, yes. I wouldn't talk to the Murdoch press, but otherwise, talk to journalists and try to get university discourse out into the public sphere. Nevertheless, and despite all of the attacks and all of the retrenchment, I do feel that universities represent, you know, our best hope for the future. We have this constant stream of aspirational young people coming to us, and our best hope for influencing public discourse and creating an enlightened citizenry does lie with universities. Columbia is a very special place because, you know, and it's deeply problematic because it's an elite university. It costs a gigantic amount of money. It's located in New York City. We grapple with both the good sides and the bad sides of that. It's nice that we get a much larger share of public attention than we deserve. It's bad, of course, being a bastion of privilege has a lot of problems also. That there are wealthy and powerful people who try to pull rank and try to impose their will on the university, and we've certainly seen that in the last 2 or 3 years. And I came equipped with a long list. I thought we were really going to drill down in much more detail about what horrifying things has Columbia done in the last 2 or 3 years to suppress dissent. You know, you mentioned the banning of the student groups, but that was just the very beginning. A great deal has happened since then. You might be relieved, maybe, there won't be time to drill down into those things.
It's not about drilling down, but I mean, if we think of the atrocities, be it Colombia, be it the United Nations, be it the world, we're going to be bogged down by the past. I believe that Zionism is an ending ideology, and we need to now have discussions where we're building, where we're seeing what we're going to be doing next, rather than the wrong that has happened. So I think we really need to be in present and moving forward. My mother always tells me, come to me with a solution, not a problem. You know, I think that's, I'm Egyptian, I listen to my mama. So Mohsen, I'd really love to open the conversation with people. Katie, I haven't even asked. Katie, help for everyone. So happy that she's here doing the most. But I think it would be good to open a discussion. But before that, because I'm very curious with Mohsen, especially with what you just said, because it is important. But how do you have those conversations with mainstream media without diluting the narrative and at the same time being isolated in your conversations?
I think there are many different approaches. It's not only the media. I've been visiting so many communities across the United States. Christian communities, Jewish communities, Buddhist communities, organizing communities, intellectual communities, and I think we really need to get outside of our bubble, because we know, and part of why we did not dive so much into what happened in Gaza and what is still happening in Gaza and in the West Bank, because we have the assumption if you make it to the People's Forum, you already know what you're up to and you know what is going on.
You guys know what's happening, the genocide?
But we need to break out of the bubble, and we need to reach out to communities that we would not reach out to usually, and to humanize the story and to interact with them one-on-one. The social media, another thing that is very powerful, and actually one of the most powerful achievements of the pro-Palestine movement, that it has created the infrastructure that is still there, that people connected through social media, where information sharing is no longer only through the mass media. But we have to try everything, and we have to measure our ability to measure our energy and make priorities, where to put our priorities. And there is a framing, of course. So most of my framing, if you're familiar with the work that I've been doing, I'm a believer in democracy. And I believe that the democracy here, not democracy has failed itself, but it has been destroyed or deteriorated on a very severe level. And I speak to communities that are not familiar with Palestine and with the Palestinian struggle in a way that they can understand it. If you come against the First Amendment, which is 45 words, the First Amendment is 45 words, and it guarantees the right of expression, whether if it is the right of speech, free speech, the right to assembly. I can see the sign there that there is some timing issue. Press and as well a practice of religion. If you think of what the government has done and has imposed at Columbia and other universities, they are destroying the pillars of democracy. And for what reason? In service of a genocidal apartheid state. So you can speak the language of the people, you need to adapt. This is called, in Buddhism, I practice Buddhism, meditation, it's called skillful means, to understand where one is at and to speak their language and to deliver the message to them. And that means also reaching out to those who, especially those who disagree with us. Because we know we're carrying something so powerful, we're carrying the truth, and what we're fighting for is justice. And justice not only for Palestine and Palestinians, it is the interconnectedness between all of the systems of oppression, that justice, if it's achieved for Palestine, it will be most likely manifested for the rest of our humanity.
It's very interesting that you say that. I went to Capitol Hill and I went to one of the staffers. They had the "I stand with Israel" sign. So I went to them inside, and it took every ounce of me not to go crazy. But I started showing her the pictures of the children and the effect of white phosphorus on these children, that it reacts with the oxygen and they continue to burn. And she told me I can no longer look at these pictures. I told her, oh no, but you have a sign that says I stand with Israel. You need to look at what you stand with. But it's having these kinds of very difficult conversations. You know, seriously, talk to strangers in the street about this. Seriously, stop people. I stopped a woman just because she was wearing a cross when the Jesus statue was broken by an Israeli, and I told her, you know, look at this. Do we have time for questions?
I'm sorry.
We don't have time for questions. I'm so sorry, but honestly, thank you so much for this conversation. It was enlightening. I know you wanted to drill into Colombia and vent, but it's about, you have to ask yourself, do I want to vent or do I want to fix? So,
Rahma, if I may, part of the vision here was to be able to talk about the violations that Colombia has done internally, half of it, and the other half looking forward. But I'm very glad that you helped us to look forward. And looking forward, this is just an example of what can be done, because we need the community, we need professors, and we need students all working together to combat the injustice, because it is not only what happens on a local level, is happening also on a national level and on a universal level.
thank you so much for this. Thank you for our panelists. And thank you everyone for joining.